It is crazy to think that Ninjago is almost 15 years old. It's honestly scary in retrospect because I have been around since the very beginning. I have been with Ninjago for nearly 15 years, and I've had a lot of opinions over the years. I've watched all the seasons multiple times, and I definitely have come to terms with how I feel about most of them. And the Ninjago pilot is definitely one of the ones that I watched the most, especially when I was a kid. And nowadays, even though it's probably easier to get your hands on uranium, it is still something I'd like to try and go back to at least once a year, just to retread over where Ninjago began. And when I did my very large Season 3 Part 2 review, which if you haven't watched please do, it definitely made me realise that I would like to give every single season that exact same treatment. So I thought no better place to start than the very beginning and go through accordingly. So this is me looking back on the Ninjago pilot, revisiting the nostalgia, wondering if it's still good 15 years on, and is it something that newer fans should go back to. Now, the pilots did actually release in two different formats, and it's widely debated as to which one is more of the definitive version. Now, there is two 22-minute episodes, or there is four 11-minute episodes, but the content is literally identical, so it doesn't really make a difference. Personally speaking, I do view them as four 11-minute episodes because I do feel like it flows a bit better in that way, so that's how I'm going to be looking at them for the duration of the video. But the overall plot of the pilots themselves are fairly simple in nature. Sensei Wu is off on a mission to find the elemental ninja to be able to defeat Lord Garmadon, as he is officially trying to get after the golden weapons with the use of the Skulkin army. But the thing is that it all intertwined with the main character of Kai, because the Skulkin turned up to his very blacksmith shop to be able to obtain the map to the golden weapons and also his sister Nia. Like I said, just this very concept is quite simple in terms of Ninjago. In later seasons, it's a lot more complex and a lot more interesting, but in this one, it is just simply put, the villain wants the weapons, and that is the entire thing that this surrounds, and I really like it for that fact. It's just the simplicity and a very nice light-hearted nature when it does come to Ninjago. It's not without conflict, don't get me wrong, the conflict is very much there because, like I said, Garmadon is after the golden weapons and he wants to use them to make Ninjago into his own image. So it's not exactly like there isn't stakes to the pilots themselves, but like I said, it just feels nice and warm. Of course, we get the establishment of all of the original core team and the initial villain of the show. Like I said, this is where we get introduced to everyone. We get established that Kai is this hot-headed ninja who almost rushes everything he does and is very much action first, thoughts later. And it's very much established in the earlier seasons that this is something that he has to get over. But in the pilots, you can definitely see it in his actions. The rushing of making the sword, the use of the scythe when he was told not to. There are a lot of different aspects to Kai that definitely show that there is a lot of character to him. It makes sense that he was the initial main character. It's funny because even though Nia is the second person to have lines in the show itself, the pilots doesn't really do anything to establish Nia as an actual character. She is the damsel in distress, and eventually she gets rescued, but she just goes straight back to the blacksmith shop. It didn't really have much for Nia in these pilots, and it's honestly a shame to see, but she was there, and it did show that she was the anchor of Kai, and I can definitely appreciate that. But like I said, there just wasn't really much to go off of when it came to Nia in this instance. The rest of the ninja team also did get their core traits established within the pilots. Cole initially was obviously this really hardened leader of the group. He had this very solid side to him and this very big tough man mentality, when in reality you could tell that he was just a bit of a softie. You know, his initial introduction to Kai was him pointing the side saying, "Hey, I've got your back and there's nothing I'm afraid of." But in reality, the line of "Hey, I've got your back" to someone he just met really does also speak a lot to the character of Cole. Jay established himself as the funny inventor. Of course, we get to see Jay's inventions actually in the pilot, which was cool to see. And again, he's very lighthearted with his jokes. He has his moments. He's the one who figures out spinjitzu. He was definitely established to be this fun guy, but also when it came down to it, he was able to lock in. It was honestly a really good introduction to Jay. And then Zane was introduced as the weird guy. You know, he was just introduced as this socially inept kind of person that didn't really understand the joke and was just trying to go along with it, but still had good intentions at heart. And it's also really funny when you realize that they didn't intend him on being a robot by this point. He was nowhere near meant to be an android, but with retrospect in mind, it still slots in perfectly with what we know about Zane today. It's honestly kind of genius in retrospect, because him being a robot perfectly fit in with this quirky character that we got in the pilots. Honestly, it was really nice to see, and definitely put a smile on my face looking back on it. Apart from those 5, the only other ones that I feel like have some sort of established meaning or some sort of character development within the show itself by the pilot was of course Wu and Garmadon. Wu was of course established to be the teacher, the all-knowing, the all-wise. He very much didn't have much of the personality that he got later on. He still was really cool. I mean, one of his first interactions with Kai was just saying that he couldn't even beat his pinky toe. So the humor of Wu was definitely still there, and I definitely appreciate it for that reason, but it definitely feels like the half-baked, the very simplistic version of Wu, especially with later on in mind. And Garmadon is one of the more interesting cases for me. Pilot Garmadon in retrospect actually feels a lot different to what we get later on down the line. He's much more passive, his voice is a lot more calm as well, he's just a lot more chilled out, and it's really interesting to note that. And you can actually see he's quite smart in what he does. Of course, he never really leaves his seat in the underworld to actually do any fighting, which again feels very different to Garmadon now, who is the first one in the fight. Honestly, I found that interesting to look back on because it did feel very different, but you can actually see the intelligence of Garmadon in that moment. He was just seeing what Samukai would do. He knew Samukai was going to betray him, so he waited back for Samukai to meet his own demise. And there are more things that Garmadon does that further establishes the true intelligence of him. One bleeding question I always had is why Garmadon wanted Nia specifically in the very first episode, because we know for a fact that he wanted her because Samukai says outright Garmadon said take the girl, and it was always something that kind of confused me because he only ever really imprisons her in the fire temple. But later on, you do actually realize that Garmadon knew the Samukai wouldn't have been able to hold all 4 weapons and bring them to him. So he kidnapped Nia so Kai would take the sword. And he tells Kai that. He says, "You're going to take the sword for me." And I never really thought about it until I thought of it in the context of he wanted Kai to take the sword and bring it to him because Samukai wouldn't have been able to do it himself. It's kind of ingenious because Garmadon in retrospect was really smart in the pilot, and it feels like that's definitely still there in Ninjago, but it's definitely more covered up by the newer arcs that he does have now. But honestly, going back and seeing this side of him was really a nice thing to see, and quite refreshing if anything. But like I said, the 4 ninja, Nia, Garmadon, and Wu were the characters that felt like they wanted to truly establish in the beginning. And it does feel, like I said, that Nia was underused, but the thing is that it does feel like all the characters still felt fairly unique nonetheless. Honestly, considering they didn't actually have too long to establish them all, it felt like they really did do a good job, and for that reason I do commend them for it. In terms though of not really established characters, I guess I will just bring over the Skulkin for that. I mean, it is quite fun to see the initial army. Skeletons have definitely solidified their place in terms of Ninjago's lore, Ninjago's history, and everything that the community knows. I mean, if you say skeletons, you do think of the Skulkin. You don't think of the more recent villains, you definitely think of the OG army. And they are a really cool army, and definitely one of the best armies that the ninja could have gone against initially speaking. Honestly, it is very solid for that reason. And Samukai in particular is a fantastic henchman, general. I don't really know how else to really consider him. He's honestly a really fun villain. I wish we definitely got more of him. He definitely feels underused and underappreciated, I have to say, because every time he was on screen, he was definitely a menace. And I can speak for when I was a child, I could definitely say that Samukai was a very intimidating villain for the time in particular. But to move on from the characters in particular, I want to talk about the next thing for me, which is the animation. I do think it's one of the more interesting things to note because it is the earliest point of Ninjago. Of course, the animation is much simpler. You can definitely see that, especially when they do have some sort of callback to the exact same things in later seasons. I mean, think of when Cole was climbing in the mountain in the pilot in comparison to Cole climbing the mountain in season 8. The detail is very different, and you can definitely see where Will Film improved on their craft. involved. But that doesn't mean the animation was bad by any account. It was fluid enough, it was quite nice looking, it was just very simplistic in nature. But the thing is that there was absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think there is a charm to the earlier Ninjago seasons for that very reason. And honestly, there are still elements of the pilots that I think looks better than modern day Ninjago. You may be wondering what that is, and I'm going to cover it in a future video, but there are certain elements to the pilot that, like I said, just look better. The main thing that comes to mind for me is the golden weapons. Gold has never looked better in Ninjago in comparison to the pilots. The weapons look absolutely gorgeous and they stand out in every shot. I wish the weapons still look like this in modern day. I can't believe how nice the weapons looked, especially 15 years on. But I honestly do believe the pilots still hold up animation wise. There is nothing outright wrong with it. I mean, of course certain fight scenes may look a little rushed in comparison to other aspects of Ninjago, especially like I said in the modern day, but it doesn't look bad whatsoever. Like when I think of fight scenes, I mean the ninja versus the Skullkin, when they take the Scythe of Quakes, it looks quite good. There's nothing outright wrong with the fight scene at all. Wu versus Samukai looks fantastic. There is nothing wrong with the animation whatsoever. Like I said, it's just sometimes the background of the shop just may look a little empty. But you cannot deny that when they do have those wider shots that really establish where they are in the world of Ninjago, you can't deny that it still looks nice. I mean, the very first shot of Ninjago of Wu walking up to the blacksmith shop is iconic for a reason, and I still maintain that shot is absolutely beautiful to this very day. There is nothing wrong with the animation of the pilots. It still is a fantastic sight to behold. After animation for me definitely does come the music. I mean, this is the beginning of Ninjago, so this is where you find most of the iconic soundtracks when it does come to Ninjago. The main theme, the main fighting theme, the character themes, it is all there within the pilots themselves. And it's a reason why they're iconic. It's because they were there at the very beginning. All the soundtracks that are in the pilots were made for demand. They were made for those scenes specifically. And for that reason, I absolutely love the music and the use of it within the pilots. I think honestly, they smash it in terms of what music went where. I don't think there's any instance of music feeling out of place or ruining the tone of the season itself. I honestly think they were spot on when it came to the music. Again, almost does attribute to the fact that it is iconic. But speaking of tone, it does remind me of the humor of the pilots themselves. I do think that honestly the jokes and the laughter that you do get from the pilots is definitely, again, well placed. It doesn't feel like there are any jokes that feel out of place. It doesn't feel like they're shoehorned in any way. Later seasons can do that in some regard, but honestly, the pilots don't do that at all. Of course, they have jokes, but it's only really where they could do it. You don't have a scene of Garmadon or Wu cracking a joke when they're having their final confrontation at the end. There is no sort of leeway given to any sort of humor because they just simply didn't want to do it. You got the jokes when they felt natural. And honestly, they were fairly decent jokes at that. I don't think there is anything actually wrong with the jokes within the pilots. I think they were just perfectly timed. I don't have a problem with them. But with all of that out of the way, and before I do get into an overall, with every single season, I do want to have a moment where I acknowledge certain things I liked more than most, and certain things I may not have liked. And to begin with a more positive note, I do just think on an overall the pilots were paced out really nicely, and I do think every single episode had something that I definitely enjoyed and feels very memorable to me. In retrospect, it truly does feel like there's nothing in any of the episodes that don't really come across as really fun. I do think all four of them had something I really enjoyed. In the very first one, I loved the fight with Wu and Samukai. I mean, I didn't even touch on that fight scene, even though it is really cool. I mean, Samukai is just an absolute menace. I mean, even then, the first episode has the backstory of the weapons, and the fight between Wu and Garmadon, and the training scene with Kai. Honestly, it's just such a good episode. And it doesn't even end there, because the golden weapons being the second one, you have the fight between Kai and the ninja, which is really fun to see, and them at the Caves of Despair going after the Scythe of Quakes. They learn Spinjitzu, which I didn't even mention the fact how good Spinjitzu looks in the pilot episodes. That also looks fantastic. But again, really solid, fun episode too. Episode 3 had the really fun scene in the fire temple. You got to see Kai with his own shadow beating him. You got to then see Wu using his own shadow to beat the shadow Kais. Such a cool scene. And then the rest of the ninja chasing after the Skulkin. I mean, they show abilities of the ninja in this episode alone that I really do wish return. I mean, Jay is literally running at pace with trucks, trying to basically go Mach 3. That's such a cool thing, and we never got to see it again. And then it goes out saying episode 4 was also just straight up goated. I mean, the whole flight with all the dragons, everything in the underworld, the tornado of creation, the fight between Wu and Samukai, and the ending with it all stood around with their golden weapons. Just amazing all round. There's no problem with those episodes whatsoever. They're so cool looking. And honestly, they're all just so memorable for that very reason. But then on the other end, just the very small nitpicky thing I can say about the pilot that I do wish was a little more. I mean, a lot of attention was given to getting the Scythe of Quakes and also the Sword of Fire. However, the Nunchucks of Lightning and the Shurikens of Ice were basically just done via a montage. And I think that is honestly the only issue I take with the pilots. I do honestly think that it would have been better if all the golden weapons did get time to shine. Zing. But the thing is that they wouldn't have been able to do it in the time frame that they had. So I honestly understand why it's the case. It's just simply it would have been cool because they could have utilized the different settings in some very interesting ways. But honestly, it's not a deal breaker for me. I don't take overly an issue with it, and honestly, I can live without it. And I also guess if I was to really be nitpicky, like I said, it would have been cool if Nia just had more. I understand that she just doesn't really have a place in the pilot, and I just don't think they really intended on her being too much of a character by this point. And luckily season 1 does rectify this and gives her a lot of really cool stuff to have. So again, it's one of those ones where I'm not overly mad at it. It's just something I do want to acknowledge because it would have been cool if Nia was more further established by this point. But again, I'm just not really mad at it. I'm just happy with the byproduct that we actually got when it came to the pilots. But on an overall, I honestly do think the Ninjago pilots are really good. I think the nostalgia factor is definitely there, and at the same time, I do think that is something I have to consider. But I honestly do think if you are a newer Ninjago fan and you haven't seen the pilots, say you came in at the point of Dragon's Rising, you could go back to the pilots and have a very good time. They're very simple in their nature, they're very fun, they're very nice and lighthearted. I honestly don't think you would have any sort of issue or problem with them if you went back and saw them for the first time. Do they compare to some of the best seasons we ever got? No, not really. And I don't really think it has to contend with, for example, Season 8, because it doesn't really have to do that. The pilots are just there to set up Ninjago as a whole. We wouldn't have the fantastic seasons if we didn't have the pilots. And for that reason, I don't think it needs to be one of the best things we ever got. And I think, honestly, it's kind of funny to think that some people may consider that needs to be the case. But in my opinion, I really don't think it needs to be up in S tier with, like I said, Season 8 and Season 9 and Season 5. It just simply doesn't need to be there. But this is still fantastic, and I definitely think it's worthy in the spot of some of the best Ninjago seasons, just for very different reasons. And I think above all else, it is just one of the most enjoyable things that you could watch for Ninjago. Like I said, it's just fun in its nature. There is nothing overly serious. It doesn't have the darker tone of Season 8, or it isn't as light of a tone, say as the peak of the 11-minute era. I just think it's very nice and comfortable where it is. It knows exactly what it is, it knows what it wanted to accomplish, and for that reason, it definitely did that for me. But what is your opinion on the Ninjago pilots? Do you have any outright issues with it? Do you not like the pilots for any reason? Or is it one of your favorite aspects of Ninjago media? I would love to know your opinion because I definitely do love the pilots of Ninjago. I think it's honestly really fun to go back to, and I don't think you would be disappointed if you haven't seen them at all or if it's been a very long time. Like I said, if there's anything to take away from this video, go rewatch the pilots or go watch them for the first time. It's only about 44 minutes and I really don't think you'd be disappointed whatsoever. I think if you are a fan of Ninjago, establishing where it began is honestly kind of vital. And even if you already know where it began, just going and retreading over what used to be the show. It's just a very fun thing to actually go back and do. But like I said, that is about it for today, you guys. And thank you very much for watching. Take care. Okay,